I don't think we understand how profound stress is on our bodies, how profound it is on our biology and on our symptoms. And it's possible that the stress of the war flipped a switch in you. And now biologically, your body has to deal with this crazy stress trigger and perimenopausal fluctuations. And now together, you've created a perfect storm where you are even more out of balance. So perimenopause and menopause is a hormonal fluctuating time. That is the truth. But it doesn't need to or have to relate in debilitating symptoms. But sometimes an external factor, an external trigger can exacerbate it.
This is Women's Gallery, the podcast where we showcase women defining Jewish leadership today. My name's Joanne Greenaway, and each episode I interview one incredible female leader making a mark in her own way on the Jewish community. We explore different models of leadership in the context of schools, shuls, universities, Batei Din, and much more. Women's Gallery is an LSJS podcast powered by the Walder Foundation and a generous anonymous supporter. And before I introduce you to today's guest, I want to acknowledge that at the time of recording, 23rd of March, the UK has just suffered a horrific anti-Semitic arson attack on Hatzalah ambulances, and Israel is still at war after over 3 weeks with no clear end in sight. Many of our listeners, including today's guests, may seem that they are getting on with things, but they are actually running on empty, as well as running in and out of bomb shelters. And I really want to acknowledge these amazing people, and especially the women who are often holding down the home front with kids off school and really, really trying to get things done. And I want to commend and introduce you to the wonderful Jacqueline Rose, who joins me today, who is one of these women. Welcome, Jacqueline, to Women's Gallery.
Thank you so much for having me, Jo.
So Jacqueline is an award-winning integrative menopause educator and coach, and a hormonal health specialist who focuses on the role hormones play in our overall health and well-being. She trains women in hormonal health, and she's also a yoga instructor with several different qualifications for different ages and stages. And she has a very Jewish approach to women's health and maximizing our potential that I really want to get into with you today. So, Jacqueline, it's really, really lovely to be with you. I really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few weeks, and I think what you do is fantastic and something people need to hear more about. And I am so grateful that you are taking the time amongst everything that you've got going on and the sirens, and please God, we won't have another one whilst we're recording, but really, really thank you. I want to start by asking you what led you to choose this path for your career, and how do you strive to lead in this area?
So lovely to be here and sending up prayers that we will not be disturbed. So this is actually my second career. I had a first career in the environmental space. That was my degrees, and my work was in the environmental space. And then I now am 51. And when I was 40, post child number 5 and coming back from 2 years of shlichut and dealing with our eldest daughter who was recovering from quite a serious illness time, I decided to do something a little bit different. And being that I had practiced yoga off and on over the years, and being that I was sort of post baby number 5 and just wanted to do something for myself, I thought I'd train as a yoga for pregnancy and birth teacher. And that decision has led me on this journey of where I am today, spending a lot of time in the women's health space. I started off in the yoga space and I've moved to the menopause space. But with hindsight, I now realize that that decision was also probably part of my very early perimenopause journey. The decision to do something different, the decision to do something for me, the decision to not carry on in the career that wasn't really serving me anymore. And I now realize that actually, even though I was, 39 and probably too young in inverted commas for what women think is perimenopause, I now realize that was definitely my perimenopause being expressed.
That's such an interesting kind of psychological, emotional insight that I guess will resonate with so many people in different ways, that would even play into the decision-making process, like subconsciously. With that in mind, and with this shift and changing gears that you yourself have had to take on this new career, I want to understand the mission that you are on with your work And particularly, there are many people who are working in the menopause space in perhaps a more classic way. And, lots of people advocating for HRT, for example, as well as other medication. And I want to understand, why is it that you take a slightly different approach? And if you can explain to the listeners, what is that approach and why you're so passionate about it?
Okay, so excuse me, this is a bit of a long answer, but this really is how I see things. And I think part of it comes from my background in yoga and really understanding the female body, the mind-body connection, the physical, emotional relationships in how our body experiences life and how the female body especially experiences things. And I really come to women's health from a functional medicine approach. I'm not a doctor. I don't pretend to be a doctor, but I'm very, very well versed in women's health. And functional medicine is really the response to the failures of our conventional Western medical healthcare system, which really only looks at symptoms. And especially when we're talking about perimenopause and menopause, the obsession and the language and the conversation, and especially in the UK, and I really give the UK its props here because the UK is a pioneer in the menopause conversation globally, but it is symptomatic focus. It is looking at women's health from a very classic narrative that does not and has not served women over the years. And for me, I am much more interested in the why. Why are you experiencing symptoms? Why do you feel a certain way? Let's start asking questions that your regular doctor is not going to ask you. Let's really understand what is going on at this specific time of your life. So my mission is to change the way that women understand and experience their menopause journey, and then to put it in a larger context of women's health to really understand what is going on throughout a woman's life cycle, and to contextualize perimenopause and menopause as one stage of our long life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sort of is the basis for everything that I do. Yes, my focus is for perimenopause and menopause, but I also work with women and know that women struggle with getting answers and recognition of things like serious PMS or PMDD, PCOS, polycystic ovaries, endometriosis, infertility. We know that the statistics say that it can take anyone who is eventually diagnosed with PCOS or endometriosis between 5 and 11 years to get that diagnosis from their doctor. And in the meantime, women are suffering with their doctor saying, oh, just take an ibuprofen, just come back in 6 months if symptoms get worse. There is a profound lack of understanding of women's health. And because now menopause has become a hot topic, all of these things are really coming up for me around menopause. So I take a very different approach to supporting women during this time of life.
I want to come back to the kind of overarching philosophical side, because I think that's really interesting. But for my sake, to clarify, because I'm a little bit more of a classical outlook type of person, and I think that I have struggled often to get diagnosis with some of the things that you're talking about. And I am taking HRT for full disclosure. And I know lots of people have talked about how there's scaremongering around it and people shouldn't be taking it. But I wondered whether your approach kind of complements the medical side, or whether really you think that people shouldn't be going down that route at all.
Okay. So let me put out a big disclaimer. I am not anti-HRT. A part of the pendulum swing of everyone being very pro-HRT is as a response to the 2002 Women's Health Institute research that came out with this major media hype that HRT equals cancer. And the pendulum has now swung that to really show how safe HRT is and there is no cancer risk at all. And I agree with that. I do not think HRT for the non-high-risk woman really presents no increased risk to increased female cancers. That's not what we're talking about here. For me, what I want to look at is more than just HRT. Now, I believe that hormonal health is the cornerstone for women's health. But I feel that the menopause narrative has been siloed to a very specific narrative of all we're looking at is estrogen, progesterone, and maybe testosterone if you're lucky. And those hormonal fluctuations, and they're the reasons why you have symptoms. And so just take HRT, bump up your estrogen, and you'll be fine. It ignores the larger picture of the fact that we are not just reproductive women, and it's limiting the whole narrative to reproductive hormones and the stopping of our reproductive or shutting down of our reproductive system. It doesn't include the conversation of what actually is estrogen and what does it do? What is progesterone and what does it do? What is testosterone and what does it do? And what is actually going on in a woman's body during this stage of life? So take HRT if you're symptomatic. That's fine. But for me, that is just the icing on the cake. Whereas we've got to really cut the cake and see what is going on the inside. You know, those layered cakes where you cut them and you see all the colors and the icing in the middle. That's what I want to talk about. What is going on beyond it?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think it's extremely complex. And I'm just thinking very personally that when I started taking HRT, it also made other changes when it came to sleep and exercise and diet and stress. And so it's always been very, very difficult to kind of tease out, well, you know, what has made things better? And like all kavod to you, because how do you even go about assessing somebody if a woman comes to you, say, feeling a bit rubbish, a bit emotional, burnt out? Like, how can you even start to understand if her feelings relate to the menopause or if they relate to many other things that might be going on, whether it's work stress, whether it's her relationship, and all the other things that happen to people like in midlife?
So I think, firstly, it definitely relates to COVID time, now in Israel, wartime. And I have had so many clients come to me at the beginning and say, I don't know if it's the war or if it's my perimenopause. Right. I don't know if it was COVID or if it was my perimenopause. So sometimes it is a little bit difficult to piece it all together. For me, symptoms are a result, are your body's way of telling you that something is off balance, that your body is out of alignment, is not being optimized, or is out of balance. And for me, there are 5 reasons why that may be happening. Stress is one of them. And stress is a profoundly, deeply complicated thing to understand when you really understand what is going on biologically in our body with stress. But stress is a profound hormonal disruptor and a profound trigger for imbalance in our body. The next thing is nutrition, what we eat, when we eat, how we eat, sleep, movement, and self-care and connection. And for me, I work with women in those 5 areas. Again, for every single woman, it's going to look different. And for every single woman, those 5 pieces of the puzzle are going to show up in different ways. But really, at the end of the day, it is bringing our bodies back into balance and creating balance so that we can have hormonal health, so that all the different systems in our body can work together and can work in harmony with each other. And yes, HRT may be a piece of that puzzle. But if you are not looking at stress, nutrition, sleep, movement, self-care, and connection, I always say you can put as much HRT on as you want. You can, slap yourself with as many estrogen patches as you want. But if you're not looking at those 5 areas and how they are disrupting your balance, it's like pouring water into a bucket with holes in it.
Wow. Tell me again: stress, nutrition, sleep, self-care, and
movement. And I say movement and not exercise. Movement is not the same as exercise.
Movement instead of exercise?
Movement can be exercise, but exercise is not always movement. And when you hear the word exercise, it can be very triggering for women. They have an image of what exercise means, going to the gym 5 days a week and working out. That's not necessarily what our bodies need. Moving our bodies in lots of different ways, connecting with our body, listening to what our body needs. Movement is not the same as exercise. It can include exercise, but it's not the same.
Well, I ask it because, I think these 5 things really are the holy grail, and it's a really, really useful checklist. But as midlife women, not everyone on this podcast listening is a midlife woman, but midlife women are told a lot of things that they need to be doing. And one of those things is weights. And, there are lots of different needs that the body has as it gets older. So I hear you that movement isn't the same thing as exercise, but exercise is another thing that we're told that we need to be doing.
Yeah. So I think movement has to include in all of the categories, in all of the 5 categories, depending on, obviously, I relate it to the woman, sitting next to me. What is her specific story? What is her family situation? What is her lifestyle? What are the recommendations I need to make for her that are going to resonate with her? And yes, there are some baselines and some things that every woman should be doing again, but there's no point. My recommendation is never go to the gym 5 days a week, but there's no point me telling you, for example, go to the gym 5 days a week if you are a busy working mom 9 to 5 and have kids, and maybe you're living in the middle of a war, or maybe you're living in a really stressful situation. Maybe you've got parents that you need to be looking after. me telling you to go to the gym 5 days a week is just going to add another layer of stress to your already stressed out life. And there'd be no value in that recommendation.
Yeah. Let me ask you actually about that. When you mentioned living through a war, and it's a hugely important backdrop, obviously, for our Israeli listeners. And I can only imagine that when you're going through the menopause, perimenopause, etc., you've already got these hormonal issues that are causing stress. How do you look at that in the broader holistic context? And how do you support women through this period when the stress is going to be exacerbating all these other issues that they're already dealing with?
So stress absolutely is one of the, I don't think we understand how profound stress is on our bodies, how profound it is on our biology and on our symptoms. And that was sort of like the question that I always am asked, is it the war or is it perimenopause? And my answer always is, if you're of that age where perimenopause may start to show up, 40 plus, if you're getting closer to menopause, closer to your 50s, perimenopause and menopause are going to be playing a role. You may not have been symptomatic, or you may have had, symptoms that maybe you could really cope with and manage, and they weren't debilitating in any way. That is also an option. That's another thing that I want women to know. Being symptomatic and debilitated is not a prerequisite for being a perimenopausal or menopausal woman. So you may have been fine, and then all of a sudden war hits, or all of a sudden something happens that is beyond your control, and you get hit with an external stress trigger, and all of a sudden something changes. You become symptomatic, or you're not sleeping as well, or you gain weight, or you've got brain fog, or whatever it may be. Yes, it absolutely is the war, but it's also possible that the stress of the war flipped a switch in you, and now biologically your body has to deal with this crazy stress trigger and perimenopausal fluctuations. And now together, you've created a perfect storm where you are even more out of balance. So perimenopause and menopause is a hormonal fluctuating time. That is the truth. But it doesn't need to or have to relate in debilitating symptoms.
Yeah.
But sometimes an external factor, an external trigger can exacerbate it.
And I imagine at those times people might have even less time and capacity to deal with the things precisely when they really need to.
100%.
Really hard. So I am conscious that many of our listeners are not at this stage in life, and I'm very, very fortunate and happy that we have a whole range of different age groups that listen, and also 10% of our listeners are men. So
yes.
I make no apologies for that, because I think that I wish I'd known some of this when I was much younger. And I also wish my husband knew some of these things. So I wonder what you would say that you want them, our male listeners and our younger listeners, to know about whether it's perimenopause, menopause, or other connected issues that you deal with.
So firstly, bringing men into the conversation, I think, is critical. Women are going through a lot of these changes. And I will just talk about the male partner piece at the beginning, and then I'll go back to the sort of the larger picture of women younger who need to be aware of this. Women through perimenopause and menopause not only are going through some of these classic symptoms, but there are other things going on also. I divide up, depending on whatever checklist that you want to, follow, there are three groups of symptoms. There's the physical symptoms, the emotional symptoms, and the cognitive symptoms. And for time, I'm not going to go dive into each of them, but symptoms for me are based in those three categories. But there's a fourth category. And this, for me, is a category that no one talks about. And I think for Jewish women, this is especially profound and important. And the fourth category is the spiritual symptoms. And I don't mean spiritual in terms of your relationship with God. I mean spiritual in terms of your relationship with yourself and the profound changes that you are going through as you navigate into the next life stage. And the next life stage is post-menopause. And that's where we are going to spend, all being well, a good 30 to 40 years of our lives. And while we are in this transitional stage of perimenopause and menopause, we are going through profound spiritual identity changes. Those questions of, who am I? Who do I want to be when I grow up? Maybe this isn't what I thought my life was going to be like. Your body shape may be changing. The things that you accepted about yourself, you don't want to accept anymore. The way you used to show up is not the way you want to show up anymore. Classic example, you don't want to entertain for Shabbat. You don't want to have 15 people around your Shabbat table anymore. or intimacy between you and your husband may not be the same. It may not look the same for symptomatic reasons or because of identity reasons, because of who and what you are and what you need. And so many women don't know what they are going through. Many women, it creates a lot of conflict. It creates a lot of tension for themselves and their loved ones around them because they don't understand what's going on. And when you look at your husband and you're like, why doesn't he get it? And why can't he support me? And why can't he understand? It's because you are not telling him what is going on with you, because very often you don't know yourself, you don't have the language, and you are not able to explain it to him. The minute that you have the language, which for me is a really important piece of my work, you are then able to communicate in a very different way. A great example I have is a client that I had who was in her early 50s, and actually her and her husband were on the same page. But what was different was her teen kids, and she didn't have babies in the house anymore. She was 53. She had like a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, and some older kids were not at home anymore. She didn't want to cook dinner anymore during the week. She was done cooking dinner. It was her 16-year-old and her 18-year-old who turned around and said, what's going on here? Where's dinner? Why do I have to make dinner for myself? And it's about the things you want are different now. You want to show it's not just empty nesting. We can highlight it's not just COVID. It's not just empty nesting. It's not just the war. It's not just all these things that we like to use as an explanation for what's happening.
But I think these identity shifts that you're talking about, for many people, they might think, well, I need to go and see a therapist, or I need somebody to help me explore these things, or I need couples therapy. But how would they know that this is actually a case of needing work with their hormones to come and see you?
Yeah. So firstly, that's part of the training program that I've created, this menopause informed training program for practitioners, so that therapists and coaches that these women are going to see because now they've got problems in their relationship, or they've got, they go to see a life coach or a business coach, that these coaches and therapists have this perspective and understand. Or you are going to see a menopause coach or maybe, a menopause doctor for the classic symptoms. And then sometimes it comes up. But yeah, it's difficult to really know. And very often you can get treated for the symptoms, take your HRT, get treated for the symptoms, but you still don't feel right. There's still something else that is not connecting. And that's really where I come in, and that's all the work that I'm doing, and all, my workshops and my trainings and my work with women, because I feel that people are not talking about this. Everyone's treating the symptoms. No one's talking about what is really going on.
Yeah, and it really helps to join the dots. It's like the missing piece that helps for it to all make sense. And I totally hear what you're saying about the identity shifts that we go through. And I think that there are many at different times in life, but from child rearing to post-child rearing is massive. And for so many people, I see it amongst my peers, like some people have really kind of kept their focus on careers, but obviously still for those who are mothers with motherhood alongside, but many have really focused only on motherhood. And then what happens when you're no longer of child rearing age? Like that's a really, really difficult thing to get your head around, as well as your body.
100%. And I think that one of the other challenging things is this sort of profound transformation. I think I want to maybe put it in a little bit of context when you asked me about sort of explaining this or understand this as you're a bit younger. I think we need to understand women's life cycle in its stages. And we have puberty. We have those reproductive years, whether you biologically have children or not. We have perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. And I think that in our reproductive years, the way that our hormones are structured, it is for nurturing, for creating, for birthing, but it's external. We are creating, birthing another.
Mm-hmm.
Our feminine characteristics and our feminine hormones and the wiring of our brain is that we are birthing someone else. Along comes perimenopause and menopause, and it is the bridge that takes you to postmenopause. And in postmenopause, and that's why perimenopause and menopause can be such a difficult time for women. Postmenopause, our brain is rewired, our hormones are rewired, and those feminine characteristics now are turned inwards. I'm now nurturing myself. I'm now birthing myself. I'm now focused on caregiving to myself.
And that could feel selfish for people.
It feels selfish. It feels really difficult. We have a lot of expectations, especially as Jewish women, especially as from Jewish women in the community, the expectations of showing up, of being there for others, on being on this committee, on being on the meal train for that person, on all those things that we are always doing, outward looking. And then along comes menopause and post-menopause, and it's like, I don't want to do that anymore. And that transition can be really challenging for many women, for many husbands of those women, for many children of those women, and for the woman herself. But I've always entertained 15 people for Shabbat lunch. I've always been the house that all my kids' friends come to. But you don't want to do it anymore.
Is that something you see consistently? That's something you really see consistently as a pattern?
1,000%.
Wow.
But many women, there's a different way to embrace it. For some women, as we say in Hebrew, rosh b'rosh, like they go head to head with this, and it's really difficult for them. And they keep showing up in the way that is expected. It doesn't feel right, and they keep doing it. And then,
gosh, because it's so ingrained.
Yeah, and then sometimes things fall apart, and they can't cope. Or there are some women who are like, bring it on. I'm ready. Yeah. I'm ready for the next stage of my life. I've done that stage. I did it long enough. I showed up in that way. Now they get it that it's time for me, but it can be very, very challenging.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's not you're being selfish. It's that you are moving to the next life stage where you're called to do different things.
But let me ask you about that, because I think it's fascinating in terms of how we respond to it. But from a Torah point of view, like, why is it that God would want us to have these different life stages? Why is it that we're being asked to have different roles? What was asked of us at different times of our lives? Like, why?
Yeah. It depends how deep you want to get into this. I think that we have different missions for different life stages. And I think that this postmenopausal woman is very often characterized by a wise woman, confident, sharing her wisdom, sharing her life experiences. You think about the African tribes or sort of other non-Western cultures, where it is the older woman that is revered. She is the one that, leads the women's circles. She is the one that, sits around and that everyone brings their problems to. Even in our modern society, I always think about the nonnas in Italy. The nonnas in Italy, they are the women that are sitting around and cooking and baking and talking. And that matriarchal figure. We have different missions, different tafkidim at different stages of our lives. And I think very often it can be very difficult to disassociate ourselves with a tafkid that may have defined us
to move on.
When we now need to move to the next tafkid of showing up in a very different way.
But it's also a very tricky balance, because on the one hand, it's really important to be able to move to the next stage and to look at what's required of us. But on the other hand, we don't want to over stereotype. And we know that within our community, perhaps we're sometimes a little bit too rigid, and that there are those who don't fit into particular categories or who want a little bit more freedom of expression. And so it doesn't always work so neatly.
No, and I'm not saying that in our reproductive years, you have to give up of yourself and you're only focused on your children. For me, my definition of feminism is that every woman has the freedom of choice to decide how she wants to show up.
100%.
Feminism for me isn't that every woman needs to be an astronaut or a nuclear physicist. Feminism for me is that every woman gets the choice to decide how she wants to show up.
And not everybody is able to have children, even if they want to. So,
Yes, 100%. And so how you showed up in your reproductive years, and again, I use the reproductive years as a biological term, not as a practical term of that means you have to have had children. It is about where your body is biologically, hormonally, energetically.
Kind of leaning into the reality and not pushing against it.
Stages of life.
Yeah, it's really healthy, actually. And I think sometimes, especially when we're really busy and chasing our tails, we don't always stop to really listen to our bodies and to understand what's needed. So I find this
listening
really
to our
helpful.
bodies is a major, major thing for me. I think that most women don't listen to their bodies. We say, our bodies are always sending us whispers and messages and signs. The question is, are we listening? Are we paying attention? And the more we ignore it, the louder those messages get. And sometimes those messages come with severe symptoms, severe disease or illness or a diagnosis. And that's not to shame or blame or victimize the woman. It's just the listening to our body. It's a sort of, step one to anything and everything going on in women's health.
Yeah. I remember when I trained in Tarat HaMishpacha and the laws of marital purity, etc. A lot of the training was around not just the halakha, but being able to spot the signs of underlying problems, medical or emotional, so that we could then refer on. And I imagine in a similar way that if you're looking from a hormonal perspective, there will be medical things that come up that you can also refer and be in a position to be able to spot.
Yeah. I'm trained in functional blood work analysis also, and that means I look at blood work in a very different way. One of the main problems that we have in our conventional Western medical healthcare system that I'm not against, and I'm not bashing doctors and nurses, it's amazing at what it does well. But specifically for women, they get their blood work done, midlife women, they get their blood work done. Doctors say, oh, everything looks normal, everything looks within range, but the woman doesn't feel good. She is symptomatic, whatever that means and however that's showing up. For me, as I've mentioned before, and I really want to hone this in, pain, suffering, and struggle is not a prerequisite for being a midlife woman. It is not a prerequisite for being a woman at all. And I think that is something that women, unfortunately, have become very used to hearing from their doctors. Oh, it's fine. It's just normal. And I really want to relate back to the sort of godly piece of this. I don't believe God created women to suffer and struggle and have symptoms. I don't believe that was his intention when he created woman. I don't believe perimenopause or menopause is a sick joke that God's playing on women. I don't believe that. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
I don't believe that we were put on this earth to, yes, okay, maybe we know from the story of Chava that childbirth is going to be a painful experience, but we seem to have extrapolated the pain of childbirth onto the pain of women throughout our life cycle at every single stage. And something about that doesn't fit with me. It doesn't make sense that God would put woman on earth to suffer throughout her whole life cycle.
Well, thank you for pushing back on behalf of womankind and the men too. I wanted to flag up your podcast because you also have a podcast, which is brilliant. And it's called Things That You Want Your Daughters to Know.
Yeah.
So there are many, many things that I want my daughters to know. But I wondered whether you want to share a couple of insights or something unexpected that you've learned from the guests on your podcast, because it's much broader than menopause. What have you learned that we need our daughters to know?
Yeah. So the Things I Want My Daughters to Know podcast really came out of the fact that I'm blessed with 5 children. 3 of them are girls. And each of them in their own way has their own health story. And the first episode I did was with the 3 of them where they shared a lot of their story. And one of the things that came up, and it has come up again with some of my guests, my daughters shared one particular, but they've all been through this, of the conversation that they all had in Kita Vav in 6th grade about periods and their body and puberty and pregnancy and how the story is framed. Now, all my kids are born in Israel. I've lived in Israel a very long time. So I can only talk about the Israeli story, but I know from my guests and I know from all the things that, I've heard, the same is true in America and in England and probably in many other places. That birds and the bees conversation that they have is about periods. It's about not getting pregnant. It's about very siloed conversation.
Are you talking about at school or with their parents?
At school. The general conversations. It's about changing girls' body, what to expect with your period, the classic reproductive system and how everything works, and how not to get and how we don't want to get pregnant.
Particularly in the religious communities or across the board? Because I imagine it also differs.
I think across the board, and also about how do you get pregnant and how not to get pregnant. There is no conversation about what is happening with my body over my life cycle. No one's educating about perimenopause and menopause. There is a massive industry around what to expect when you're expecting. And then it sort of drops off.
And you don't expect anything.
There is no conversation. There is no conversation about a woman's life cycle. There is no conversation about changing hormones. There is no conversation about how to listen to your body, what happens when your period isn't happening according to that 28-day classic cycle that we're not quite sure exactly where it came from, some textbook, hundreds of years ago. No conversation about what happens if you're experiencing unusual bleeding, PMS. What happens if you have, a period once every 3 months? Maybe you need to go and get yourself checked out by a doctor. About pregnancy, about hormonal fluctuations, about perimenopause and menopause, contextualizing and understanding a woman's life cycle, her health life cycle, her hormonal life cycle, and understanding that what is it about a woman that the word hormonal woman is used in a very derogatory way.
It's so true.
Oh, she's hormonal. Or we say about ourselves, I'm so hormonal. I want every single woman to change that narrative.
The H word. The H word, I love it.
Reclaim being a hormonal woman, because being a hormonal woman allows you to have babies. It allows you to be a creative person. It allows you to do all these amazing things because of your hormones.
Yeah.
Hormones are seen as a dirty word. Even now around the perimenopause, menopause story, you're hormonally deficient. What is HRT? Hormone replacement therapy. You are replacing your deficient hormones because we need to keep your hormones at that level because we're not working because our hormones are not working for us.
It's reminded me of a conversation I had recently with my youngest, who's a 12-year-old girl who came home from school, and she said, I love PSHE, which is personal social health education. It's the most important lesson. And she thinks it's really like the place where you learn everything. For her, it's been really eye-opening. And actually, there is so much that we need to fit into those lessons. One of the big changes with those kind of classes over the last few years has been around consent in relationships and abuse in relationships and all of those kind of conversations that we also really critically need to be having that didn't used to happen, certainly when I was growing up, and around like toxic masculinity, particularly that, my boys in their classes learn about. But you're right, there's so much more that needs to be in that curriculum that maybe, one lesson a week is not enough.
Yeah. Part of the problem, and again, I'm going to absolutely generalize here, and I want to apologize in advance because I know things are changing. What I'm going to say is a generalization, so don't all yell at me. There is a way that we view women's health, and it is only through the reproductive system. Maybe also breast cancer can be sort of topped onto that. But really, it is about our reproductive system. Periods, pregnancy. And that narrative is now continuing into perimenopause and menopause. What is perimenopause and menopause? Our reproductive system shuts down. The conversation is always about those three hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, as it relates to our reproductive system.
We're done.
But then what happens when our reproductive system shuts down? Do we then become irrelevant? When we look at society, specifically Western culture, Western society, media, all those types of things, where is the woman 55 plus? There are much more prominent women in post-menopause. I have a few post-menopausal women on my podcast. I really want to showcase those amazing women. A woman at the age of 66 who is she's a combat trainer. She trains women in self-defense. I had a 72-year-old woman who is a serial entrepreneur. Like, we need to be showcasing these women more because the conversation is really siloed. Women equals reproductive system.
Yeah. And I think there's a narrative that starting the menopause early is somehow problematic. But unless you're still planning to have children, then it doesn't necessarily signal the end of anything in a negative way.
No.
So, moving to that stage of your life could be very exciting.
And that's why I am quite obsessed. As obsessed as I am about perimenopause and menopause, I'm even more obsessed about postmenopause because it's a conversation that no one is having. Because for me, perimenopause and menopause, as I've mentioned, it is the journey, it is the bridge that every woman needs to take to arrive at the really big event. And the really big event is postmenopause. And my question to my clients is always not how are you showing up in perimenopause and menopause. It's how do you want your postmenopause to look like? Your perimenopause and menopause is laying the foundations so that you can have a fabulous postmenopause.
Oh, you're making me really excited now, Jacqueline. The new stage.
Because, before perimenopause, either you're growing your career or you're child rearing or you're doing both or you're everything to every person. That phrase, if you want something done, ask to ask a busy person. That was me in my 30s. I was working. I was, having my babies. I was doing all the stuff. You want something done? Ask a busy person. I was that big busy person.
Yeah, me too.
It's not great. It doesn't serve us in the long run, but there was a stage
we
in
think
our
of it as a badge of honor, and why?
100%. And it's very possible that in a stage of our lives, we actually are wired to be able to show up like that. But that does not apply in our 50s, 60s and beyond.
Yeah, and it's very freeing to get past that stage and to really focus the mind in a different way. What about all the young people who you listen to on your podcast and the things that you want them to know? Do you see this shift coming through to them? Do you see them kind of understanding that they need to show up differently?
It's really interesting. I have at the end of my podcast, I ask every guest, this podcast is called Things I Want My Daughters to Know. What do you want your daughters, goddaughters, nieces to know? So many women say to me, I want them to know that they are worthy. I want my daughters to know they are worthy. I can't tell you how many times that comes up. And I always say it is shocking to me that in 2026, teen girls, young women still do not believe that they are worthy enough. They still are fighting to look like a certain image that is not realistic. They still don't have that self-value and self-worth. I find it shocking that this message still, despite feminism, despite the role of women role models in every single industry, despite how far women have come, the message is still teen girls and young women still do not feel worthy. They do not feel self-love. They do not feel self-fulfillment, and they've always got to prove it. And that to me is really sad.
Yeah, look, I think there is no more important message than that. When we bring up our daughters, I feel like that's such an important reminder. And if any time of the year to remember it, we're recording this just before Pesach, but Pesach is full of all these incredible, strong female role models, from the midwives who birthed these children when they were supposed to be killing the firstborns, and then, Miriam, who comes out of Egypt with the tambourine, and who knew that you should be running out of slavery with a tambourine because good things are going to happen. Like, we have these incredible, strong models of leadership, and somehow we don't internalize them enough and we don't focus on them. And I think what you're saying really brings that home. So thank you. Thank you for being with me on Women's Gallery. It's really been an absolute joy to talk to you. It's been a really different perspective, but I think I've learned a huge amount, and I hope our listeners have too. I wish you peaceful times.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation with me. I know it's stuff that we don't normally talk about, stuff that you don't normally talk about in the Jewish education world. And I really think we need to be, as I said, menopause is all the rage now, especially in the UK, but menopause in the Jewish community specifically, and the unique way that it shows up for Jewish women, is not talked about. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share.
Yeah, and I think you're really leading in this area and you're doing really important work. So I'm glad that we had a space to talk about it on Women's Gallery. I wish you well, and thank you all for listening. Please remember to subscribe, share, rate and review. It really helps me and it helps to grow the podcast. So thanks, and do look out for learning opportunities, classes, courses, many tours in person, online, overseas, and in-depth programs on our website at lsjs.ac.uk.